Herzlich willkommen zu Agrarpolitik, der Podcast. In unserer aktuellen Staffel, der 10. Staffel Agrarpolitik endet der Grenze, befassen wir uns mit einem Blickwinkel aus der Schweiz heraus und schauen, wie Agrarpolitik in Europa umgesetzt wird und neu gedenkt werden kann. Unser heutiger Gast ist Jonathan Baker. Jonathan Baker, a very warm welcome to our podcast.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Jonathan Baker, wie Sie hören, ist englisch sprechend. Also diese Podcast-Folge wird in Englisch stattfinden. Das ist sicher gut für die Sprachkenntnisse des Moderators, aber auch für Sie als Zuhörende. Ich hoffe, Sie können unserem Gespräch folgen und bekommen einen spannenden Einblick in diese Folge. Jonathan Baker ist Deputy Director Engagement and Strategy at the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Jonathan Baker, thank you very much that you're taking the time to be our guest in this podcast. You have been a guest at the Agrarpolitik Forum in Zollikofen 2 years ago, and you described the new path that the English agricultural policy is taking. And we are very curious to see how this played out and where are you standing at the moment. But first, the classical question, what's the weather like in England today?
The weather today in England is a little bit grey, as you would expect. We've had a storm recently. There was even a tornado in Manchester.
Really?
Which
okay.
But yeah, it's a bit windy, but a classic English grey day.
Good classic English weather. It's the same here in Switzerland. Here in Kirchberg, it's grey, windy, and rain. So we have the same weather. So, but we're not here to talk about the weather. We're here to talk about agricultural policy. At the beginning, I suppose it was a big change for UK agricultural policy with the Brexit. Did that change much, or was it just a slightly change?
I think it changed a huge amount. The department that I'm in now, when we were within the European Union, so that's the Department for the Environment, Food, Rural Affairs, as you said, a huge amount of the work was taking the kind of EU regulations and translating them into an English context. With Brexit, that changed in that the whole of the department had to stop kind of just translating those ideas and moving them forward and actually creating whole new policy areas. Yeah. So it was a really, really significant change. Was
the change an opportunity or was it a threat? What was the perspective on it?
So I think to reflect on myself personally, it was a massive opportunity. So and there are lots of other, if you're interested in policy, as you and your listeners are, I think it was a massive opportunity because for the first time, there was a chance to come in and do something very different. And I think the situation in England was that the common agricultural policy had always been hadn't fit very well within an English context, and there had always been a desire to move away from it. So the UK were always looking to reform the CAP when we were within the European Union. So having left, there was a definite sense of, okay, we're going to do something quite different. And so I think there was a massive opportunity. And actually, I came to Switzerland in the same way that you are now trying to learn from other people about how can you make agricultural policy outside of the EU and what the ideas are. And I went to some other countries as well. I think for farmers, some of them definitely see an opportunity. The changes, lots of farmers found the area-based subsidy quite frustrating. It stopped them doing things. They felt it was unfair. But there were other farmers definitely who did see it as a threat, who were worried about changes to policy, changes to trade, and just the uncertainty. You know, me as well as anyone, farmers don't like uncertainty.
Yeah, I think Brexit was a big challenge for the food sector as a whole, as it is seen from the outside. There were definitely, because like all the things changed with the trade and all the stuff around that as well. Definitely. When did you start thinking about the new agriculture policy? You didn't have much time, didn't you? Like when Brexit was reality, then you didn't have much time to develop a new policy at all.
No, so it was in 2016. Obviously, the referendum happened. So I joined DEFRA in 2018, and at the point that I joined, we had already run a big consultation, and we were ready to the government was ready to legislate. So probably within probably within about 6 months, the government was clear we're going to do something very different. Probably within a year, they had an idea of what we would do, which was move away from area-based payments and towards targeted payments. And then within 18 months to 2 years, we had the legislation ready. But now to fast forward to 2023, 2024, we're now at the stage of having finished quite a lot of the transition. We're halfway through the changes now, and things have moved on quite quickly in that time period. But yeah, it was a quick change.
It's very quick compared to the Swiss process. In Switzerland, this whole process would take 20 years or so. So it was very quick. It had to. There was no other way. You had no choice. You had to go fast. Yeah. Just for our listeners, is this new agricultural policy, as I recall it correctly, it's just an English agricultural policy. It's not UK. So there's a different policy for Scotland, Wales, and North Ireland. Is that correct?
So I mean, Swiss devolution is very different to UK devolution, but we obviously have the 4 countries of the United Kingdom, and agriculture was devolved. And when devolution was agreed to, we were obviously within the European Union, and I think that meant the actual so that the policy has always been different in those 4 countries, but within the EU, it was obviously very limited, the amount of difference. So a little bit about how you would use the money, a little bit about how you would design specific schemes, but it was all very similar. So it was, I don't know if this is quite the right expression, it was a bit of a surprise to suddenly see the ability to have 4 very different policies. And we are all following in different ways, which if I could kind of summarize. So Scotland looking to stay quite close to the EU approach, still quite area-based subsidies with some top-up environmental schemes. Northern Ireland, similar-ish, but they've got some quite innovative models. For example, they're paying all their farmers to test their soil and create LiDAR. I don't know if you know about LiDAR maps of their farms, so they can see exactly what's happening on their farms. And Wales are a bit more similar to England. They're moving away from area-based payments and will launch a kind of joined up, which is quite a Swiss model, sustainable farming scheme in 2025. And then in England, we are removing subsidies. We're halfway through that process and roll out targeted payments for environmental land management and productivity. But that suits the fact that actually the Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland are very different. So lots of livestock, much more remote compared to lots of England, further away from agricultural markets. And often a bit more marginal land, kind of harder land to farm. So they are all quite different nations from an agricultural perspective.
Can you tell us a bit about the English agriculture? How many farms do you have, and the average farm size, so that as well our listeners can have a little overview?
So we have about 80 to 100,000 farm businesses. So the reason for that difference is there's about 85,000 farmers who claimed the EU subsidy, the basic payment scheme. So those you can think of as being more likely to be fuller time farmers, and they were farmers that were recognised in the EU system. But there then is quite a large group of very small farms of around 20,000 farms that are kind of smaller. So we're talking maybe 10, 20 kind of hectares or so. From my memory, I think the average farm size is about 50 hectares. But perhaps we'll have to double check that. But I think it's about 50 hectares.
No, that's okay.
But in England, we have a small number of very large farms that are a fairly significant size of farms that are maybe 300 hectares. And then there's, as I said, quite a large number of smaller farms. So it's quite a broad distribution. And that was one of the reasons why we wanted to move away from area-based payment, because the 10% of the biggest farms used to get half of the money, over half of the payment. Because when you're getting paid on the size of your field and the size of your land, those 10% guys would get the majority of the payment, and not for doing a huge amount. So now it's all kind of these targeted payments, environmental land management instead.
So that's if we switch to this agricultural policy. So you said it's moving away from area-based payments to targeted payments. What are the main goals in that shift? And you said you're halfway through, so there are still some area-based payments and
Yes.
could you maybe we start at what are the targets, the main targets
Yes.
of the English agricultural policy?
So the main targets are, firstly, we want to maintain domestic food production. We have a target to maintain food production, which we produce between 60 to 70% of the food that we eat. So we want to maintain.
How do you measure that? That's a big discussion in Switzerland. We're measuring it in calories.
Yes. Yeah.
How do you measure it? Because calories, I think it's a bit, it's difficult to measure it in calories, because if you produce potatoes, you have a lot of calories. If you produce vegetables, you don't have much calories.
So I think we measure it in both ways, and we produce regular reports across both of them. I think the main way we refer to it is, from my recollection, the main way is around calories. But both in terms of calories, so in terms of calories, it has been quite stable. I think in terms of contribution to GDP, obviously it's reduced because the rest of the economy has grown. But in terms of the headline gross value add, I think it has been slowly increasing. But a lot of the value of our food product is a bit like in Switzerland, we add a lot of value. So kind of Scottish whiskey, kind of smoked salmon, cheese, those products. But yes, we measure it in that way. And it's been fairly stable now for the last 20 years or so. But that's one of the goals, so to maintain that food production. Another one is we want to improve farm productivity, so that all farm businesses can thrive without subsidy. So we have a specific goal of moving away from subsidy, as I said. And to make that work, we have to increase productivity, because losing the income support means if farmers don't change in any way and they're not supported to change, they will struggle to thrive. So we are helping them respond. The third aim is to restore nature and contribute towards water, biodiversity, and then also to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is the last goal. So to reduce the agricultural emissions within England. And it's worth noting that those last two, the restoring nature and decarbonising agriculture, reducing emissions, both of those we have legally binding targets. So they are set in the law that we have to achieve those things.
And by achieve those things, you mean agriculture as a sector?
Yes.
And it's the production, just the food production, or the food sector as a whole?
So the food sector as a whole will have separate emissions. So we know, so because agriculture makes up about 70%, manages about 70% of the land in England, and I think is responsible for a significant and growing proportion of emissions over time. So I think if we were to do nothing, agriculture would be the biggest emission source in England by 2050, because of where it is. So we know exactly what we need agriculture to do. The rest of the supply chain will have to make other changes, particularly around net zero and becoming more productive and efficient. So looking at energy efficiency and so on and so forth. But we're able to be clear about what we need agriculture to do. And because we have these legally binding environmental targets, if we aren't able to show the public and our stakeholders that we have a plan to achieve those targets, we will face judicial review, and we will be taken to the courts for being unlawful.
And who would be taken to the law? It would be
the minister,
the farmers, or the minister.
It would be the minister. Yes.
The minister.
So we already have that in some areas around greenhouse gases, and the government's plans around net zero are being challenged and scrutinized regularly. But we have a pretty clear plan from an agricultural perspective.
Let's talk about the plan. That's the plan to get to that goal. So how do you what are the main pillars to achieve those goals you said that you see?
So the three main kind of levers that we have are so the rules that we set, so the regulations. So the rules that we set and how we work with farmers, and how we work with farmers, how we enforce those rules is particularly important. There's the funding that we provide that I can talk about in a minute. And there's also the conditions we put around farmers. So access to labor, energy prices, stuff like how the supply chains work. And what's quite important is around the relationship with supermarkets. But to just focus on the payments. So in 2020, there was £2.5 billion which was the same as we had within the European Union.
Mhm.
And 85% of that went on area-based subsidies, so the basic payment scheme, and the rest went on environmental schemes. Where we will be in 2027 is that 0% of that money will go on area-based subsidies, and about 90% of the available funding will go on targeted payments to improve the environment. So we call them environmental land management. I think in the EU it's agri-environment schemes or agri-climate schemes or eco schemes. There's lots of different language. But by 2027, the 90% of that funding will be going specifically to improve the environment.
Yep.
And the remaining 10%, and we spend about 10% now, will go on improving productivity, agricultural research and development, and innovation. And where we are now, it's quite a straight line in terms of reducing the subsidy. So farmers are now will have recently received their third reduced payment. And for most of those farmers, they will now have about half of the subsidy that they used to get. And we've massively increased the spend on the environmental schemes as we've taken down the spend on subsidy. And we now have about half of all farmers who claim the basic payment scheme are now in an environmental scheme at the moment. And we've seen a really big increase in the number of farmers in those schemes. And that trajectory will continue.
The basic payment scheme is this just this is just still area based. So you have hectares and you get paid without any. You have to follow the law, but you don't have any specific activities you have to undertake to get
just the cross compliance schemes. And it's different to the Swiss, the PEP. It's different to Switzerland because this is still based on the EU cross compliance, so it's lower conditions, lower requirements than the Swiss PEP. But actually, from where we're speaking today, the very end of the year, so from the 1st of 2024, farmers for the remaining years that we are reducing the payment will no longer have to comply with any of the cross compliance rules. And they will no longer have to apply to us each year to access the subsidy. Because we're getting rid of it and we've already reduced the payments a lot, we're going to de-link the payments, whereby we will go, for the last 3 years, you got A, B, C. Therefore, we know that for the next 4 years, you'll get so on and so forth. And we will just give them the money as a kind of one-off.
For the transition phase.
Exactly, because we're getting away from it, we're breaking the link, and we don't need to. And just one thing, the rules will still exist. Farmers will still need to comply with the law. And we're doing a lot of work now to make sure farmers understand that they still need to comply with the law. And we're seeing, farmers understand that. It's not a surprise.
So the basic payment scheme will end in 27. And will be zero. And then the 90%, as you said, will be paid on the sustainable farming incentive scheme. Is this correct?
So we have, at the moment, the way we've got set the schemes up is, so one thing that is a challenge is that we had lots of farmers in legacy, so older agri-environment schemes. So one of the things that has been hard for the last 3 years is moving farmers from old schemes into new and creating new schemes. So where we are as a farmer now, you can apply for the Sustainable Farming Incentive, SFI. So this is a scheme which is the same everywhere. It's about sustainable food production. So we include stuff like paying farmers to reduce pesticides use, paying farmers to use nutrients and fertilizer more efficiently, and also creating some space for nature on their farms, but kind of a hedge corner. And in an English context, hedges. I don't know if you know about hedges. Hedges are very important. So stuff like that. That's captured in the Sustainable Farming Incentive. And then we have a thing called Countryside Stewardship, which sits alongside SFI. They will be a joined up scheme. But Countryside Stewardship was the scheme we had in the EU that we have changed quite a lot, and we made much simpler and easier and added more things to. And that is more about creating some space for nature on farms. It also includes more complex changes, like creating specific habitats for kind of nature. And those schemes farmers can apply for. And we made some quite big changes to how we offer those, because farmers told us things that they didn't like. So, for example, we now have a rolling application window. You can apply any time of the year. You get paid 4 times a year to help with cash flow.
Yeah.
We've made the application process much easier. And we've also removed, before we used to say, here are like 10 things you have to do as a farmer, and here are very clear dates. Now we say, here are the 2 or 3 things you have to do. Here are some dates, and here is what we want you to achieve. So it's less prescriptive, and we provide a lot more emphasis on farmers doing the right thing. And if they've tried and they haven't done it, we come along, we help them. If they haven't tried and they haven't done it, then we'll come along and say, well, I'm afraid we're not going to fully pay you.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And how do you handle it? It's if it's target based, so you have to say, okay, you say you have some points you have to comply with, you have to do that, and you have to have this date, and you have to achieve this target. And if they don't achieve the target, do they still get paid, or do they get paid half? Or because in the Swiss discussion, that's a big problem. How do you do you reward targeting? Like if you don't get the target, if you work on a target for like 3 or 4 years, and at the end you don't get it, and you don't achieve it, and then you get only paid half or zero, well, that's a big uncertainty. How do you handle that?
Yeah, so we don't have, it's targeted in that it's a very specific, there are individual actions that farmers can choose from, but it's the payments are not targeted in that they have a kind of payment by results, which I think there are maybe in the Swiss system, and we have in the EU system. So we have looked at whether or not we can pay farmers if they achieve a certain result. But our assessment was, farmers said that they were worried about it. They would see it as, they often like to engage with an environmental scheme as a way of a low risk way in their farm business. They don't want, there's already enough risk if you're a farmer. There's the weather, there's the markets. They don't want extra risk that's often out of their control. So they said that they were worried about that. And it's also quite complicated for us to put in place and then come along and monitor. So we don't have payment by results other than a couple of small pilots, but we hope to bring it in future years. But if you're a farmer, so at the moment, it says here are the aim that you have to achieve, and it's for farmers to tell us if they have achieved it. We then review a certain proportion of those farms to make sure that they are doing what they said that they would do. And if they're not doing it, then firstly, farmers every year have to tell us what have they done, and that's their opportunity to say, I tried to do this, but it hasn't worked. Yeah. Okay. And if they've tried to do it and it hasn't worked, we won't fine them, so we don't claim the money back, but we will equally won't pay them. And if we come along and the farmer has said, oh, I've done this and it was fine, and we come along and actually see that they haven't done it or it hasn't worked, then we have to have a discussion and work out. And if we have to, then we will, restrict them in future. But one thing that's really important, because we are taking away the subsidy, which is very challenging for farmers. We have also had farmers have quite low trust in working with government. They didn't think we were very effective. They didn't like our IT systems. They thought we were unfair. So a really important thing for us is to build that trust with farmers, because if you think about that, 90% of the money that we will be offering, that's all voluntary. So if farmers don't want to log on to our website, if a farmer doesn't want to do one of our schemes, then they won't, and then we won't achieve our targets. So we need to create a system that farmers want to work with us, or else they won't. They'll just stay away. And
does that system work? How do the farmers respond to all these changes and to your? As you said, there wasn't much trust, so you have to build up that trust, and you had to change, and you're taking money away. So
exactly,
there are big threats to the farmers. How do they respond to this way you're going?
Yeah, so I think there's two things. There's kind of in principle, so the idea, and then there's the delivery. I think in principle, so the idea of moving away from subsidy to targeted payments, lots of farmers didn't like the subsidy payments. They felt it was unfair and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. Lots of farmers do like the idea of being paid for targeted environmental payments. There are some farmers who are worried that it's not supporting them for food production. Yeah. There are some farmers who are worried that they will lose their business when they're relying on receiving the subsidy. So at an idea level, I think there is broad support for the idea but there are still groups who are worried. So on the food production thing, we talk about how our schemes will actually help food production. They help improve soil, they help improve your yields, they'll help lower your costs.
Yeah.
And then, so that's the principle, which I think there is support for, but some people are worried about, and some people are worried about their individual business. There is then, how is it working in practice? And I think some farmers, as I said, we have almost half of the farmers are in schemes, and most of them have seen their experience get much better. They feel like the schemes are much better. We are getting much better feedback. But there are still people who find the change kind of difficult to manage and to follow. So as well as running your business, they have to keep up with all of the other changes, which they can find frustrating. So we have to make sure that they understand the information in an easy way.
Yeah, and have you developed some sort of advisory system around the farmers to help them to develop the new scheme, or to set up the new schemes and be productive with them?
So I think we have done. So unlike the Swiss system, we don't have a extension service or a government-funded advisory service. Yeah. But what we do have is, firstly, we've done a huge amount of work with farmers to design our schemes to make sure that they work with their businesses. And actually, we've taken lots of ideas from farmers, for example, around regenerative farming, stuff like cover crops, no tillage, other ways in which people manage their grasslands, so kind of mob grazing. We've taken those ideas and we've put them into our schemes. So we've listened to them and worked with them. We've also done a huge amount of work going out and talking to farmers and explaining the changes. So every single day, either one of my team or one of our team is out talking to farmers, either just at an event that we've set up, or an event with like a farmers union, or at a auction mart or whatever. So we are very proactive in talking to farmers and explaining the changes. And the other thing that we've done is we provided free advice to farmers, but not by us, but by trusted advisors that they can choose from. I think we've had maybe 20 or 1,000 farmers have received that free advice. And that was going, the subsidy is going, what can I do? Can you look at my business? I've got these worries. Can you help me respond to this change? So, and that has worked really well. And we're looking to kind of carry on that to help farmers respond to these changes and get them the skills that they need.
Yeah. As you said, you're talking a lot to the farmers, and you said the schemes are sometimes based on experience and ideas from the farm. So, so a farmer can apply and say, I've got an idea for a new scheme, and that's how I want to do it, and then you do it. Or how does this process work?
Yeah, so that's a good. So if you're a good example of that is we've got lots of different, we kind of call them co-design groups or groups where we work with farmers, and those would. So maybe the best way to describe it is, we know that the changes that we need to make to the environmental changes, as I said, the targets we have to restore nature and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we know what we need to do. And what we did as an exercise, we looked at, okay, what are all the things that farmers do that will help us achieve these targets? And what are the things that farmers do that will help us achieve the targets that we don't currently pay for? And lots of that was around precision farming and arable, improving soil health, and a host of other measures. So agroforestry is another example. So we then sat down with farmers and talked to them and said, we think we need to help farmers improve their soil health more or do more agroforestry. So what we would go to farmers who are doing those things and talk to them about what they were doing, and then set up groups where we work together to create new actions that we're now gonna. Some of them were already available, and a whole bunch more will be made available next year. So it's less a process of individual farmers putting their hand up to say, I've got this really good idea, although there was a bit of that. It was more us going, we really need kind of more trees in the farm landscape alongside food production. Who's doing that? Okay, let's go and talk to those guys. And one thing we also do, we really increase the funding for innovation and research and development. And a big part of that has been not just universities or researchers doing the work, but it all has to be linked back to farmers and the supply chain. So solving quite practical problems, like how do you get more of your yield into the supply chain to avoid wastage so that you don't lose profit, like quite practical problems. So as well as the kind of taking farmers' ideas around the environment, we've also been taking farmers' ideas around productivity and trying to create more funding for that.
And how do you work in Switzerland? There's a big discussion, like all the schemes, they add value to the product. Usually, if you say, okay, we have this, we have no pesticide in wheat production, so the bread sold at the supermarket is worth more.
Yeah.
So we said, okay, actually, maybe there's no necessity for the government to pay for that, but the consumer can pay it.
Yes.
So value added for the product should be paid by the market and not by the government. How's this discussion in England going?
Yeah, so I think it's a definite an issue. We, as the government, we have to, we treat spending public money very seriously. So you have to make sure, actually, are we spending this? Do we need to spend this, or as you say, will the market pay for it? So one difference, I think, a little bit between the Europe and Switzerland is around organic. So we do support farmers to convert to organic, but our schemes our new schemes don't provide extra payments for organic farmers specifically. What we do pay is, say, if you want to reduce your pesticide use, we'll pay you. But if you want to go all the way to being organic, that you don't get a special top up on that one. And the reason for that is because, as you just because we're already paying farmers to achieve these good things. In the English setting, we're much more interested in paying farmers for doing actions rather than kind of having systems in place like a organic system. And partly it's because, as you say, the market can reward some of those products. Outside of organic, we are quite relaxed at the moment about us paying for that. There are markets out there around really high quality meat or really high quality sustainable, particularly meat, really, because I think that is much more evocative for customers. If we were to see that emerge further, then I think we would have to look at, do we still need to pay for this? But at the moment, there is still a really big market failure there around sustainability. So we see ourselves having to continue to kind of fill that gap and pay farmers for the public goods that they provide for quite a long time.
Okay. When I look at the clock, we're already over our time.
Oh, sorry.
It's no problem. I hope our listeners will not have a problem, because I have one last question I would like to ask you. You said you traveled around, you saw other systems, you came to Switzerland, you got to know the Swiss system. We're currently in a discussion to maybe change our system slightly, or maybe in a bigger way. It's an open discussion. Do you have some advice for us in Switzerland from your experience, from the process you had in England, from the problems you faced, from the opportunities now you could see which opportunities you can take and which problems are just too big? Would you give the Swiss authorities or the lawmakers good advice from England for us?
Well, the first thing, so I think the Swiss system is fascinating and was quite a big inspiration for us in England, because it was so focused on, it's different, but it was much more focused on sustainability, and it showed that you could really be focused on that alongside food production and alongside the farming sector. So there's a huge amount that we learned from the Swiss system. So from our experiences, the things I would learn is be very clear on what you are trying to achieve and be bold in trying to achieve it. So we want to maintain food production. We want to restore nature. We want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We want farmers to thrive without subsidy. So have that really clear articulation and set those quite challenging goals, because we have seen that farmers are enthused when you can give them, when you say, we are a part of a big mission that's going to restore nature, we're going to keep growing food, we're going to do these things. So I think be really clear on what you're trying to achieve and be really bold on that. The other advice that I have learned is about to go out and be really curious. So when you said, here's what you want to achieve, go and talk to the farming sector and say, what's stopping you do that? And that's what we've learned. Actually, farmers do want to apply for our schemes, but they don't like being fined if they get it wrong. They don't like the fact that the application process is really rubbish. They don't like the fact that they feel like we don't trust them. So if you go out, be curious, and remove the things that are in the way of what you're trying to achieve and be really, really focused on that. And then the final thing I think is good for all policymakers is to be humble. So you're going to get things wrong. So we launched a scheme last year. We did it in a certain way. It didn't work as well as we wanted it to. So we changed the scheme, and we've now simplified it and made it much easier. And we're now seeing over 100 farmers a day apply for the scheme, whereas we never had anything like that before. Yeah. So I think be humble, but tell people we're going to try, we're going to listen to you, we're going to make it work, so that when you do make the change, when we made that big change last year, farmers didn't freak out and go, oh, they've messed it all up. Like, they knew that we were working for them. We knew that we were listening to them and that we're making the change in response to their ideas. So they were like, okay, I understand why they're doing it. I wish they'd got it right the first time, but okay, this is better. So I think if you have that humbleness, you talk about, we're going to learn, we're going to try and make it work, then I think you're, and farmers have seen that you've gone out and you've listened to them, you're much more likely for to succeed.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for this talk. Thank you very much for the insight to the process of the development of the English agricultural policy. It was very, very interesting for me, and there's much more to talk about. I think we could talk for hours, but our time is up. We will include some links in our newsletter for our audience so they can develop some further information about the programs and the schemes in England. And I'm sure if anybody is interested more deeply in your system, they can contact you for a talk, or maybe to get more information if that's needed.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much, Jonathan Baker, for this talk.
Thank you, Andreas.
And I wish you a good rest of the day. And we're recording just short of the end of the year, so I wish you a good end of the year and a good start in the new year, and all the luck and all the good ideas you will need to further develop the systems in England.
Thank you very much. It's appreciated. Thank you.
Das war die dritte Folge unserer 10. Staffel Agrarpolitik, der Podcast. Endet der Grenze heute mit einem Blick nach England. Aus meiner Sicht einen sehr spannenden Blick nach England. Ein neues System, das aufgrund des Brexit aufgebaut werden musste in sehr kurzer Zeit, auf gewisse Prinzipien, die auch in der Schweiz abgeschaut wurden. Also Jonathan Baker hat ausgeführt, dass er sich in der Schweiz auch umgeschaut hat und auch unser System als gute Grundlage erachtet hat. Spannende Ideen, wie Sie das in England weiterentwickelt haben. Für die Zuhörerinnen und Zuhörer, die das Englisch etwas schwieriger zu verstehen war, wir werden im Newsletter die Links zum Programm in England bereithalten. Könnt ihr das nachlesen, auch übersetzen lassen, wie man das ja kennt von Google, um sich einen Einblick zu verschaffen. Ich kann jetzt aus diesem Gespräch und auch aus der Zeit zu der Recherche für diese Folge kann ich sehr empfehlen, etwas nachzulesen, was in England gerade abgeht. Es ist sehr spannend. Jonathan Baker hat es gesagt, es ist nicht alles Gold, was glänzt. Es gibt Herausforderungen, es gibt gewisse Dinge, die nicht funktionieren, aber es gibt viele gute Ansätze und auch gewisse Dinge, die funktionieren. Ich denke, wir können in der Schweiz daraus etwas lernen. So, das war's. Wie gesagt, die letzte Folge von diesem Jahr, auch die letzte Folge von dieser kurzen Staffel, Ende der Grenze. Wir werden Sie dann mit einer 11. Staffel überraschen, die wir in einer Co-Produktion hergestellt haben. Mehr dazu werdet ihr dann hören. Ich hoffe, Sie haben diese Folge und diese Staffel gerne gehört. Rückmeldungen wie immer über info@agrarpolitik-podcast.ch, Newsletter abonnieren auf agrarpolitik-podcast.ch und die üblichen Spendenkanäle sind bekannt, sofern Sie den Agrarpolitik-Podcast auch finanziell unterstützen möchten. In dem Sinne wünsche ich einen erfolgreichen Tag und wünsche einen guten Rutsch ins neue Jahr.